What do rules, barriers, silences, and molds all have in common?
They were all
They were all
They were all made.
to be broken. We are not run of the mill.
We are not replaceable parts.
and we are very proudly weird.
We're neurodivergent Newfoundlanders and Labradorians.
And this
Is
Alterminds.
Humans of the digital airwaves, welcome to Alterminds Podcast. Today's episode is one that the community has been eagerly anticipating, and that's the dark side and light side of being neurodivergent.
So before we begin, we want to mention that while many of us have neurodivergent traits, that those traits vary. So I have autism and ADHD, but the way that I present is not the way that Terry presents, and the way that Terry presents might not be the way that you present, and we all present very differently. So in this episode, we're talking about the light side and dark side and how that relates to us and our neurotypes. So you might relate to it, but you might not.
That said, both Kay and I are deeply involved in Newfoundland's autism community, so we can pretty much guarantee that what we discuss is going to be extremely relatable for most of us, as well as a great learning opportunity for those who'd like to know the real autism community of Newfoundland and Labrador. So without further ado, let's start with the light side. Kay, remind us what your neurotype is, and please tell us what your favorite part of that is as well.
So autism, ADHD, I also have mental health illness. So not just autism, ADHD, I also have depression, anxiety. And my favorite part, or the part that when people say that they wouldn't get rid of their autism or whatever, right? The reason why I wouldn't get rid of mine is because of my pattern recognition. I enjoy being able to observe and recognize patterns. Everything that I have has a caveat of there's a dark side to it though.
Right? And that's what's so great about this topic is we get to explore both. So if you want to jump into the dark sides as well,
Yeah.
I
I want to say on the flip side of that, often we can predict things not in a psychic way, in just a pattern recognition way. We could see things that are about to happen and people don't believe us. Or they think we're being dramatic, and then the thing happens, and you can't really say, I told you so. I mean, I try to say I told you so a lot, because I'm that person who will remind people, yeah, I was right, but don't care. And no one ever feels sorry for treating you, like you were crazy.
That's true. I mean, my neurotype as well. I mean, as far as I know, as far as the diagnosis has gone, I'm autistic, what they used to call Asperger's syndrome before it was taken away from the DSM-5 or whatever. And, I'm pretty sure that I have ADHD traits as well, and that there's some overlap. It's something that I plan to bring up in another assessment at some other point in the future. But I do think that, growing up, I presented a lot more with ADHD traits than I did with autistic traits. And then my autistic traits started to present much more, and my masking started to happen and whatnot. And so, for me, my favorite part is not so much the pattern recognition aspect of my own neurodivergence, but just I was able to harness a lot of traits in hyperfocus for writing and completing solitary tasks. And that's so important to me. Because not only does that allow me to ground, and does it allow me to step away from a lot of the more darker sides and the negative aspects of my traits when they do come up. But it's really important to me, and it gives me an edge. It allows me to sometimes, dare I say, even outcompete my neurotypical peers when it comes to free writing and stuff. A lot of people will be like, Terry, how can you just sit down and write? And I'm like, because I can block out absolutely everything that's going on around me, hyper focus into one thing, and then just let my imagination kind of channel through my fingertips, and everything just fades away. But then there's a caveat. I was going to go on my own dark side, because there's a dark flip side to that too, and that's monotropism essentially. And so if someone snapped me out of this state, it is I feel almost attacked. It is like
Yeah.
you want to scream, "What? What is it?" Right? But meanwhile, from someone else's point of view, if they were to interrupt me while I'm writing, they're like, "Oh, okay, like just back off. I just asking you if you're thirsty. I'm like gonna bring you a coffee." And I'll be like, well, I'm working. When
Mhm.
when I'm in my zone, you have to not try to snatch my attention because it will physically feel like you're whipping me with a bullwhip. Like you just like it's the same kind of feel. Maybe that's a little bit of a heavy metaphor, but you know what I mean. Like
No, I get
it
it.
tropic split is a hard thing for me. I can't focus on more than one thing at once. But when I do focus on one thing for a specific amount of time, I tend to do it very, very.
Yeah, I tell people, so in my advocacy work, I will actually tell professionals and parents and stuff to, what would you call that? To nurture monotropic flow and use it to their advantage, especially like teachers and educators.
Yeah, I mean, it can be used to your advantage. A lot of us kind of naturally learn to use it to our advantage, or we discover that there's a strength there and that there's one of a relief there too. And it's something that we can fall back on for our self-esteem. We get exposed to so many negative messages about ourselves and about our traits almost constantly. So when we can actually find a part of us that is golden nugget in or like a diamond in the rough for everything that people have been bombarding us with in regards to those negative messages, we're going to naturally want to nurture it because it actually comes to a conclusion where we could say at times in our own like semi-arrogant way, like, my autism or my traits end up giving me a strength that outcompete you and then make you seem plain by comparison. How are you going to respond to that, right? And of course, some people get really defensive about that. But when we are bombarded with so many negative messages, we need to salvage whatever aspects we can for our self-esteem. And so we may come off as arrogant for a lot of neurotypical people. They don't have to deal with the constant bombardment of negative messages that we do to begin with. And so we have to balance it.
So
Right?
true.
Yeah.
I would add to that that's probably one of my late sides is becoming really because of hyperfocus and because of the ability to have that monotropic flow. And I have a vast knowledge of things like that I'm interested in. So like special interest, I guess, would be a light side for me, and being able to become really knowledgeable on a topic. Or for some autistic people, it's like they're really good at certain activities or hobbies that they have. So for me, it's not with my hands, it's more like my knowledge. Like I like reading and researching things. So like that. And I can do that for hours at a time, days at a time before I had a kid, but like hours at a time now.
Yeah. I feel that when you have a kid in the mix, it's like the monotropic split thing is something that you learn to deal with quite a bit too.
Yeah.
I mean, you have needs. There are needs that exist outside of you, but at the same time, they're part of your own immediate needs. But you can't anticipate and you can't really focus on, or if you do focus on your child specifically and you have that kind of monotropic focus for your kid only, then all of a sudden the other tasks around you. I feel like parenting is something that's unique for neurodivergent.
Yeah. That's a light side for me, for sure. Sure, every parent has a dark side, where we get frustrated and like things, and yeah, that happens. But I find my parenting, oh my God, I could talk about that for like days, honestly, because I love the way that I parent. And it's the one thing that I never thought I would be good at, or I never even thought I would be a parent. I didn't want to have kids because I'm kind of selfish. So I was like, I don't think I could. But then I got pregnant and was like, went through the options, right? Of like, what should I do now? And then I was like, yeah, having a kid would be a cool experience. So I had a kid. And
All right.
I absolutely love being a parent. It has really hard times. Don't get me wrong. It's really hard sometimes doing it alone. But I like kids. I think kids are phenomenal.
I love kids. And I mean, I'm always on my end, because for those who don't know, Kay and I are both single parents to a kid who's around the same age in the same age group. And we're all for that single parent experience, as far as I'm aware. I'm definitely all for the single parent experience. And that
Yeah.
whenever I have to work with others, whether that's in a relationship, with co-parenting, with job, with anything else, I'm not good at it. So
Yeah.
I'm single. If I'm the person that has the only amount of control in regards to things like parenting, or in regards to a lot of team activities and stuff like that, I excel with solitary tasks, things that I can manage myself and that I don't need to anticipate how other people are going to react to things.
Right.
Points of views are, I can't do that. It's not something that comes naturally to me, let alone easily.
No.
Or that. But I love it. I love being a parent. I've always wanted to be a parent, and I couldn't ask for a better kid than.
Yeah.
The only thing is that, like, I'm autistic, my son is autistic, and as we mentioned at the beginning too, everybody's traits are different, and so there are
Yes.
some times when, as the trope goes, one person's stim is another person's trigger. There are
Yes.
times when my son has very immediate needs that have to do with sensory environment stuff and other things that completely clash with. There are times when, for example, in the morning, I am like a raw nerve, and this
Yeah.
is because I get bombarded with a sensory experience in the morning. I've been like it my whole life, and it takes a while for me to basically like build myself up brick by mental brick to actually become a person who can think. And so if in the morning, very first thing, I wake up and my son's probably been awake for like 10 minutes more than me, and I come out like the other day and I see a bunch of cheese slices and the fridge door wide open and this and that, because like I'm the only one in the house, I will
Were
react
the
like,
cheese slices were the cheese slices out of the package?
yes. And the cheese was stuck to the walls, the floor, the chairs, the table. Half of the pack. It took half the package for Max to probably realize, like, wait, Dad's gonna get mad if
Yeah.
like,
This is
trying to
not,
see
this is not the buy.
yeah, I got mad, and I felt so bad after. It was like the kid, like you had told me, that was a moment where I could have been like, hey, we made a mess. Looks like we had to clean it up.
Yeah.
First thing in the morning, I'm a raw nerve,
Yeah.
experiencing all the sensory input without actually having the wherewithal to do much with it. I got mad. And so there are moments like that when it is, and that's the dark side parenting aspect of autism. But at the same time,
Yeah.
him and I can connect and understand each other
Yes.
fundamental level that many neurotypical parents have such a hard
Mhm.
understanding their autistic kid, but I experience none of that. So I actually have a preference in that I'm happy that my son is autistic and I'm autistic because I can read the book. Whereas that's the exact opposite dynamic that a lot of parents report and where a lot of their struggles come. So I'm lucky.
Yeah, I think even so when I was growing up, I always kind of felt like the black sheep of my family and that's not because I have neurotypical parents. It's because my parents are neurodivergent and are very high masking. I don't know I'm not going to sit here and armchair diagnose them or anything, but I know that they have neurodivergent traits and that those traits when they were growing up were like shamed out of them. And then it becomes like a cycle then where like you also feel like I felt a lot of shame growing up because like I just couldn't do things the way that everyone else could do them. And I was always having a really hard time. So yeah, either neurotypical parents who have autistic kiddos don't understand, or high masking neurodivergent parents not understanding because they're not letting themselves. They're not letting them, because they like for them it's like I don't know. It feels like there's the shame goes so deep that they're not willing to recognize. Like it's almost like they're not willing to empathize because of that like shame, right? So like they have so much shame about being yourself. I think it's very similar to parents who have queer kids and the
Our
parents.
closets themselves,
Yeah,
maybe.
exactly. So like it's such a heavy amount of shame that you are now dehumanizing your child a bit, right? And acting like they're an other. They're like other. And that's how I always felt. I always felt othered. So I think
Right,
that's, yeah. And I like that my kid will never feel that, and I don't think Max will ever feel that from us. Like they won't feel it from us, the othering.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that a bit on my end too. And for those who don't know too, I'm technically part of the queer community, part of the
Cool.
2S LGBTQA plus community. I am an ace person or a gray sexual person, and that there's some fluidity there, and my default mode is very asexual or an
Mhm.
aromantic. It didn't used to be that way, but it's a fluid thing.
Mhm.
And so it turns out my father is ace too. And the man is like 25 years older than I am. like him, it was not always the case. In fact, for a long time, it was the exact opposite. The dude was like quagmire. But I'm going into detail, right? And so it's, when I came out to my dad and I was like, Dad, so like, how this is how I started it out, don't really have any interest in romance anymore, don't have any interest in anything physical anymore, and essentially just decide to live a life of solitude. I'm pretty sure he's autistic like I am. Won't armchair diagnose like you said.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah. I'm like, well, so it turns out there's a word for that. I'm way too. You know that. We're both kind of the same way. I'm ace. I am asexual. It means I have no desire for that. I'm also aromantic. I have no desire for anything else. And he's like, well, that's just having common sense, my son. Let's go.
Yes. So what the generation is like.
Right? And so it's like, so there's a dismissal, but it's not a negative. It's not necessarily taking away any, it's just their lens and their interpretation of it. He's like, well, I'm that way too, but as far as I'm considered, that's just, maturity kind of thing, right? Like, but it is what it is. And I'm glad that I have that acceptance on my end too. And I want that for Max if there's ever any need for that.
Like, that's a big thing for me. Because kiddo being raised by a single parent who presents as femme is, I think, like, I was socialized as a girl and a woman, so I also socialize him very similarly. So, like, he's probably going to have more feminine traits that are going to be, and I want him to accept those parts of himself, even though that's difficult because society already, at school, like the other day he wanted to wear his hair in a little, like, he has like shorter hair, but he wanted a little ponytail. And so I put a little ponytail in his hair, and he went to school and one of his friends kept saying that he was a girl. So he took it out, and I was like, first of all, what's wrong with being a girl? Second of all, you looked really cute with your little ponytail. Like, that was, so it's just so hard because already the kids at school are heavily, and I could go on with that because I could go on about how, like, they talk about queer people indoctrinating people, but really the indoctrination is from the straights, because, like, if you're not anything but straight and, like, the binary genders, if you're not that and binary, you are disgusting apparently, and you shouldn't be allowed.
Don't get me started. And I mean, as much as we probably should get off this tangent, I want to make one point.
Yeah,
Go
ahead.
is that a lot of the time this thing is approached from just the most off the wall lens, in that it's seen as anti-scientific or more spiritual. But it's just updated science. These are the same people that might be just as surprised to find out that Pluto is no longer considered a planet, and that there are only 8 planets in our solar system. These are the same people that might not know much about eugenics, not know about epigenetics in terms of how genetics works. Like, there's a lot of people that don't update themselves on science. When I told a friend of mine that who had that view that biology textbooks now have a separation between gender and biological sex built into them because of all we've learned through science, they're like, oh, that was because of lobbying. No, it's because it's because of peer-reviewed scientific evidence.
They always have something to say about it. It's because of lobbying. Lobbying who? The textbook companies? Like, who would we lobby to get, like, who are we sticking at knife point being like, change it or else?
If you've been working 12-hour shifts for the last 10 years and you just haven't had time to update yourselves on the science, it's okay, man.
Totally get it.
Understand. But try to find a way to update yourself before you,
or at least listen. Like listen. Yeah. That's what bothers me. Here's a dark side, and that's what bothers me. Like, I was talking about my light side being that I have, like, a vast knowledge of things, and then I am very knowledgeable in specific subjects and stuff like that. What bothers me, I lost my train of thought.
It's okay.
It's back. It's back. Is that people don't listen to you, even though they know that you know more about a subject. Like I could read all these, like, I got all my books up, right? I could show off all these books in the specific subjects they're in, and then I could tell someone or talk to someone about gender and sexuality, and they would still, like, some people would still argue with me, and I'd be like, why? You've spent 0 time on this subject. Why are you arguing with me? Like, you just have an opinion. You don't have, like, an actual educated opinion. It's just an opinion.
right? You're working on facts that you had probably learned when you were still in high school.
Yeah.
And it's 2024. We're in our 30s. Like, maybe take a step back. I've read it
Yes.
since school. You probably haven't, right? Like,
That's
that's
that's a dark side for me, is like not being listened to, I think. And that's probably a general feeling by many autistic people, many neurodivergent people in general, is like not being listened to.
it is a strong one. I mean, it comes from arrogance. It comes from this profound hubris that people, and it's widespread. And in a way, I can't blame them because it's what's been plugged. It's the information that's been out from the get-go. But they automatically approach neurodiversity, different neurotypes, as in neurotypicals are the default, neurotypicals are the paragon, everyone's supposed to. And if it isn't that way, it's the result of something going wrong.
But they even think that that's like a farce. Like, we could talk about that being a dark side too, is that when we talk about the science, they think that we're making up that the neurodiversity movement is strictly a social movement, when this is not the case, when neuroscience is like a fairly new science. And the reason why we're just seeing now evidence come out about different neurotypes and even the way that autistic brains function versus a non-autistic brain, we're able to see that more, is because of stuff like in neuroscience that's happening, like really cool research, right?
Yeah, and that's it, right? I mean, they panel off as a spiritual thing, but it's like what we just talked about. They're operating on a basis of knowledge that hasn't been updated yet. Neuroscience has proved that different neurotypes exist. That autistic people have different brain structures that allow for areas in some brain structures, I should say, to be stimulated more than others, and then others understimulated as a result. Right? And like, this is part of the reason why a lot of us have twice exceptionalities, like dyspraxia, my dyscalculia, from certain aspects, because certain parts of my brain don't receive as much stimulus as others. And likewise, my ability to accidentally memorize things is stimulated. I accidentally memorize things a lot due to my neurodiversity, and that's a light side. I'm glad that I can accidentally memorize things. I read one line of Shakespeare, or like Shakespeare, when I was a kid, when I was like 11 years old, and I could still say, "To be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep no more, and by sleep to say, we end the heartache." I could do the whole soliloquy.
Brava.
I read it once.
Yeah.
It just happens. And so, like, these are aspects that we have that are not only not discussed a whole lot, but a lot of us express these aspects of ourselves. A lot of us who are, for example, non-speaking and are autistic have this ability, but they have no way to really express it so that others know that, right? But it's part of them.
Something that bothers me a lot. Like, that's a huge dark side, in that it's not so much a dark side of autism as much as the dark side of society and the way that we don't care for people. The lack of supports for non-speakers is, I want to say, well, it's horrible. That's, if listeners can take one thing away, that's the thing I would like you to take away, is to advocate more for non-speakers in your communities, especially if you're a professional listening. Advocate more for non-speakers. AAC. Like, when you think about your daily life, like if you go to the doctor, for example, imagine now that you don't speak, like how that would feel, right? Because you try to go to the doctor unless you had someone with you. But even then, they're not you. They're not in your brain. They might not say all the things that you want them to say. If you can't write, or if you can't read, which is the case for a lot of kiddos, because they can't read or write yet. So they're non-speakers, and then they also can't read or write. So it's like a lot. Yeah. A lot of barrier there.
There is. And I mean, we could say that on a community level, that's one of the dark sides that we experience, in that there's such a lack of support for those of us who are non-speaking. And on the flip side of that, so much privilege for those of us who can. And a lot of times we use our privilege to help our community in the best way that we can, if we're autistic and we can speak. And people don't realize it's not, people think that just because there are autistics who can't speak, that means that they can't understand language.
Oh, that's again,
Like,
Fundamental. It's fundamental. Like they don't understand the brain. You
yeah,
don't understand the brain if you think that.
and so like a lot of people be like, "Oh, my kid don't understand what's going on."
Yeah,
The Newfoundland
I've heard
accent.
that.
My kid don't understand what's going on around in Africa. Like, I promise you, your child does.
Yes.
And people assume that non-speaking means non-thinking, and it's so much not the case. I gave my son his AAC device the other day
Mhm.
because he's getting used to that now.
Yeah.
It was the most he's ever communicated to me in a succinct way. But
Mm.
for and we have more music and more play. Maybe not verbatim for that, but like that.
Mm.
I was like, yes, we're getting up right now. Even 30, we're about to have some playtime and music time because you asked for it on your AAC device.
Yes.
And people don't know. And it's like this, and people are like, well, it's not that way with my youngster, Mrs. I promise you it is.
Yes.
There are certain things that we know a little bit more about, and you don't necessarily have to take everything that we say for gospel, but you need to at least consider our point of view.
Yes. And like for me, it's about what I've learned like through my studies, right? So like having a degree in neuropsychology. So like specifically my interest was studying psychology, but through a biological lens, meaning like through the brain. Like so it's figuring out what it is about your brain physically, the structure chemically. What is it about your brain? Yeah, that might make your behaviors different. And we know that the language center of the brain can completely be functioning and in perfect tip-top shape, and someone is a non-speaker, which means they have apraxia of speech. So it has to do with the like delivery, the pathway of like more so what makes the muscles move in order to produce speech, I think is like what's going on there. So that has nothing to do with the language center. And you saying that you're or even they'll say stuff like this client has, like I've heard this professionally too, which is where it really ticks me off, because as a professional you need to have your own like ethics of keeping yourself up to date with research. I know it's hard because you don't get the time at work to do it, or life's really busy and like all the stuff, I know, but like you really need to. It's really important. But mental age is not a thing that we use anymore. We don't say someone has a mental age of 12 or 2 or whatever. I've heard that, and I've heard parents repeat that, and I know they're getting it from professionals because that's where it comes from. It comes from psychology, and we don't do it anymore. We know that it's because even when we look at IQ tests were not tested on people with differences or disabilities. So like, even if you did do an IQ test and it shows that you have a lower IQ, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are mentally a different age than somebody else. It just means that you lack certain skills, right? That like the academia thinks is important, really, because it's academic skills, I think, more so, or like skills that make you more privileged in our current society that people care about.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a good segue. And it talks about another dark side in that society is not meant for people like us. It is not, it ought to be, but society is meant so that socially wired, socially streamlined people get ahead while everyone else is kind of left behind. I read an article that said that even among teachers, when they're asked to pick their favorite student, it's always the most sociable, most talkative student who ends up getting picked by the teachers as the favorite, the one that they can engage with the most. Whereas people who are introverted and people who, coding wise, that's essentially autistic, ADHDers, people who, are not necessarily shy or have social anxiety, but maybe have these limitations that make them not as vivacious in that aspect. These are the ones that get left behind. There are so much. I always say that yes, we are disabled as autistic individuals, as
To get
neurodivergent.
diagnosed, it needs to be a disability. Like you need to have, it
Yeah.
needs to be disabling. Yes.
But most of what disables us is the fact that our society does not exist to accommodate us.
Yes.
I can't deal with rooms that are very loud and echoey and that have a lot going on. Most workplaces, a lot of workplaces,
Yes.
absolutely have nothing in place that, they'll be like, well, can't you bring in a pair of headphones? Yeah, I can. The only problem is that headphones aren't going to do much to the fact that there's a chainsaw going over there, that there's welding going on over there, that there's millwrights over there doing what they're going to do. Headphones isn't going to cut that. Like, I'd have to picture my own ears,
Yeah.
and it's And so when it comes to accommodation, when we ask for accommodation, a lot of people that translates in their mind as asking for special treatment, but it's not asking for special treatment. It's asking to be able to do the same thing that everybody else
Just like a
can.
fair playing field. Just a
Yeah,
fair
it's
playing
a
field.
fair field, exactly. A lot of people with really far right outlooks try to look at the playing field as even for everybody, and that is a
Yeah.
perfect measure someone's success off of.
It's
Because everyone's
wild.
the same, and they're all just
Yeah.
it all depends on how hard they work. The world is much more complex than that. It's an
Way more nuanced.
yeah. And so, like, one of the lighter sides now is that there's so much going on in neurodiversity that is promoting equity, and we have this sense of justice that plays into that. A lot of us have heightened sense of justice traits. You yourself are an activist. You push for equity a lot.
Yeah.
I do my best to do that as well on a community level. And it's through this that we're building a society that does take our traits into account, so that there's no such thing as a neurotypical person having any advantage in even the smallest way over us in our careers, regardless of where we end up putting our energy in and regardless of what our careers actually are. That's the end goal we want, and that's the bottom line in the strive. So that's a positive aspect.
Yeah. And like for me, I've been working since I was like 16. Like, I would do like summer jobs and stuff like that. And I've always struggled with work in general. So like that's always been, and then right now I'm currently off work because I got burnt out and I'm like basically building myself back up after being just like ripped apart. So like I know a lot of our community is unemployed. I know a lot of our community is underemployed, meaning like not getting like full-time work or not getting paid a living wage. And it's a big thing of that is because workplaces are not supportive or inclusive of what we need. Because like even when they try to be, I should say, there's fundamental changes that need to happen to make things universally designed, which I think gets missed all the time. Like when I bring that up, I feel like people aren't recognizing what I'm trying to say. Like even with schools, I do this where I'm like, the school asks me like, what else? What like the principal from something, which I've had happen. Principals ask me like, what else can we do to make this kid have an easier time in school? And I'm like, you have to advocate for fundamental changes because it's impossible to make this inclusive because it's been built exclusionary. It's built off being exclusionary. Like society in general is built off being exclusionary. So you can't change little pieces of it and make it inclusive. No, you need to fundamentally have shifts, movement. Like it needs to fundamentally change. Like even test taking for schools, like that fundamentally needs to change because not everybody can take a test. Not everybody can write. Not everybody can read. How do we do testing that still, it's like people who are deaf or blind are not getting what they need when they need to take tests anyway. And like neurodivergent people aren't getting what they need when they need to take tests. Schools aren't even universally designed for people with physical disability, let alone any other type of disability. And the same thing goes with workplaces, where workplaces are set up very much like school and has a hierarchy there and everything that's very much like schools. So from the get-go is exclusionary. That was the purpose of it, so that only certain people, I could go on a rant, only certain people get access to education while other people do not have access to education. Then those other people are othered more, and then they don't end up being contributing members of their community because they can't, because they've not been given access to school.
If ever there was a space to rant, this is it. I can guarantee. I will do it. So you might as well join. Yeah, and that's perhaps, I think we nailed it there. I think that's hits the nail on the head for what might be the darkest aspect of neurodivergent, and that's that we live in a society that doesn't really seem to want to even adjust a tiniest bit of their privilege to make sure that we have not an easier time, a less hard.
No, yeah, just like just a time, just like if we could just have a time, if we could just have moments, that would be great.
And that's so what we're pushing for. I mean, it's hammered home by so much what we see being pushed for in the autism community. I mean, the transfer from autism awareness to autism acceptance. We want a place. We want a seat at the table. Nothing about us without us in an autistic in every room. We want to make sure that none of our traits, the dark side or the light side, interferes in any way with us being able to have the exact same quality of life as anybody else. So that in being neurotypical, doesn't mean that someone has an automatic advantage over any other neurotype.
Yeah. They do, though. They absolutely do. That's maybe that is where it starts with people, like, especially if people are listening and they aren't autistic or they are, what, you know what I mean? In general, realizing where your privileges lie. Because even as an autistic person, we can recognize, okay, we're able to verbally communicate. So that's a privilege that we have. And we can recognize that we're both white. So that's a privilege that we have, right? So like recognizing where our privileges lie and then advocating for people who are nothing like you, who are nothing like you, who don't have those privileges. What does the world look like to them? What does it feel like to them? And then like, how can we make it more inclusive? Yes, what's some light things? Let's end with some light stuff.
All right, and we've still got a fair bit of time. What's another light thing for you that you find, big or small? It doesn't matter. What's one of the key things about your neurotype that brings an often welcomes?
Probably my creative side, which like I like that I like eccentric things. Like I'm very eccentric and I like eccentric style movies. I'm really into like weird and unusual things, strange and unusual, as Lydia would say in Beetlejuice. I myself am strange and unusual. I've not always been like that. Like I've always been interested in weird things. So like I like that though.
Same as
Yeah.
that's what I love too. I mean, a lot of people call it autistic idiosyncrasy. We do things in our
Yeah.
own way. We tend to feel most comfortable when we're not fitting in, and we don't have much of a desire to fit in. We don't surround our interests based on whether or not someone else is going to reciprocate. We like what we like, and we tend to dive headfirst into those things. But we give, not too many airborne SH, like apostrophe T's, about what people think about us in regards to our interests. It allows us to dive headfirst into the things that we really do love. We can derive joy from things that neurotypical people can't even imagine. A lot of them look at us with pity as if we just have these lives that are so bland and vain compared to the rich social lives that they enjoy. But yet we can get so much more. Our heart can pound and race and go out of our chest from a tabletop game, from
Yeah.
a solo round of Minecraft, from just reading a good book, and our interests are just as fulfilling to us, more fulfilling for all we know than anything that would otherwise enrich the life of neurotypical people. And so they don't really set the standard for what's enjoyable and what isn't. We can soak so much joy out of things that they've
Yes.
never been able to.
I was just about to bring that up. Like, I think that's a light side is socializing. Like, I feel like there's that misconception that autistic people aren't social. And I think autistic people, some of us believe that and like think that that's true. But the truth of the matter is that we socialize very differently. We socialize very differently. So like my relationships with autistic people are much more deep and they're much more connected than they are with neurotypical people. And I think that's because of the way that autistic people socialize. I think for us, it is a little bit deeper and it is a little bit more connected and like often has to do with our special interests. So like there's some connection of like people who are interested in similar things connecting.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the big thing. Like bonding over shared special interests is something like it.
Yes.
I think in Community, there was a character named Bree who touched on like Abed and this other autistic character
Yes.
because autistic. They're like, I don't understand why they just don't touch tentacles and download. It was like there was that unique friendship, they were speaking shorthand with each other and so along those. And I mean, on the dark flip side of that, I do sometimes like I am one of those autistic people who do identify as asocial
Yeah.
or hard time socializing, and I think I'm coming to learn that a lot of that might be pessimism. A lot of that might be learned
Oh,
the fact that I am late diagnosed, that I might have been rejected by neurotypicals, and that I have found
yeah.
it hard to get along and socialize with neurotypicals. And so it might be some internalized ableism on my part. I might feel,
So.
hey, like, I know it's internalized ableism.
No,
Terry.
I'm fairly certain. No, because it's trauma, right? Like we all have so much shit, so much crap
Swear
to
now.
unpack. Like, we have so much poo poo to unpack, and most of that has been put onto us by other people. Like, being rejected is huge, especially when you're young. like, and being rejected over and over again, or being criticized even. Like ADHDers are criticized exponentially more throughout the day than non-ADHDers. And like even being criticized that much has an effect on who you are and who you think you are. Because if
And
you're not in an environment to flourish, then how do you flourish, right?
I'm trying not to cry, so we're gonna just move on to something that's a little more lighthearted.
What's another light thing? Well, see, that's a light thing is like our connection. Find it. Yeah, I find it. I find that as I got diagnosed, I was able to accept myself more. And then I was able to find friends that accept me. And that has been life changing because I grew up not being accepted. Right? Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of times I don't feel accepted. I feel very accepted among my community. That is so
Right.
true. It's been life changing. It's done wonders for my self esteem, like I said in our pilot episode to Bree, and like Bree was one of the foundational aspects of that.
Mhm.
You know, it's been wild, but like masking is something that's been really hard for me, and it's something that I've always had to do. There's never been a
Yeah.
time when I've been in a relationship, for example, that my masking didn't stress me out and that I could never fully be myself. There's never been a time when I've had a job that I didn't have to mask 24/7 to the point where I didn't, my alarm would go off in the morning and I'd physically, because I
Yeah.
I didn't have the energy to do it. It's rough. But leading into the light side of that again, I mean, solitary tasks and
Yes.
being able to
Love.
have these niche careers and stuff. Like, I'm a writer. I will always be a writer as per this thing in the back and what have you. And it's a perfect career choice for me because a lot of it is solitary. The most social stuff that I'll have to do in regards to, and I do have some social aversions. I'm moving into things slowly. But the most social aspect that I'll ever have to do with writing, for the most part, ideally at least, is a book signing or events that are similar to that. But there's so much in the writing world that I did not anticipate, in that a lot of the times it's not even about how good your story is. It's about who you know and
Yep.
how marketable your book can be to
Yeah.
whatever group of people you've rubbed shoulders with. And so that's why there's so much mediocrity in the slush pile, and why so many, like, for example, really, really, really well written, great works of fiction and other forms of writing are just sidelined and they never get published because they're competed by works that are honestly kind of meh, but they
Yeah.
have this person who knew that person who's cousins with this
Yeah.
person who thinks that there's a market for one of the topics of one of the chapters of their book, and then just wasn't, right? It's about what they can sell
Yeah.
based can be turned into a meme and be spread around socially rather than a lot of other aspects. But if we're talking about pure skill within that niche career, the solitary aspects of being neurodivergent and stuff, you look at J.D. Salinger, James Joyce, Emily Dickinson, these were all writers who were posthumously diagnosed as autistic, and they were most of the great writers that exist. So in regards to how they their works are and their traits allowed them to flourish with, like, that's their light.
I think that there's like this formula thing too, where like they want writers who, same thing as like people with movies, who follow like formulas of like how stories are supposed to play out, and I find that disgusting. I'm like, that sounds so boring.
It's so predictable.
And the
Like when
movie industry is trash now because of it. Like the movie industry is like plummeting. Like I went to watch a new movie or tried to watch another movie the other day, and I was like looking because I love movies. I grew up. That's one of my things is movies and TV shows. And I was like, and I was like looking, and it was like all the same poo poo. It was all the same poo poo.
we can
But I
say we've broken down that barrier.
broken
We
my
are
mirror.
a podcast that says
Shit.
yeah.
All the exact same shit that's just been regurgitated and might be slightly changed for this movie and slightly changed. Little plot points here changing. But it's the same stuff. And I'm like, they need to spice this up. This is atrocious. But then I'm like, wait, do neurotypicals like this? Like, is there a market? There must be a market for it. Because if they're doing it.
Yeah, and I mean that's another light side we could touch on real quick. We have pattern recognition. For us,
Yeah.
story structures, if you stick to traditional story structures and traditional story
Oh, we'll
format,
know what's happening.
we will be able to predict. I know how a lot of movies are going to end less than halfway through them. Same thing with novels.
Same.
And so I employ a writing style that makes sure that it's unpredictable. And that's what I like about a lot of like Hunting Helena, for example, is one of the books that's come out of Newfoundland. It uses an avant writing style. It doesn't follow a traditional story format or structure. And as a result, it keeps you on the edge of your seat. And so like that's a lot of neurodivergent writers and a lot of neurodivergent creators, people in videography, they employ that same thing because they want to purposefully put aside those four character mirrors of story structure and all those traditional marketable formats, because eventually those will just be able to be copied by AI and there won't be a need for any people to be involved.
Yeah.
Like, what are you going to do? But
Yeah.
in wrapping things up, Matt, we are getting kind of close to our
Yeah.
line. Do you want to have any other points that you want to put forward? Anything that you feel like you might have missed or anything you want to touch on?
Yeah. Well, I want to let people know that, like, for the mental health stuff, and this is a dark side, right? But like, it's something that I think is important to talk about. That many of us suffer with mental health illnesses because of the society that we grew up in. It's not, I don't like to blame it on my autism. I don't like to say because I'm autistic, but because I'm autistic, you're more at risk to mental health illness, and you're more at risk for suicide ideation and suicidal thoughts. So don't be afraid to talk about that openly. Like, I talk about it fairly openly, my experiences, and that like every day I go through suicide ideation and I have to talk myself down off the cliff, essentially. And metaphorically, not a real cliff. I'm not actually on a cliff, but I mean, like,
That's not a literal language we're using right now. We're just being.
Yeah, we're being creative. So I want autistic people to know that they can talk about it, because I think talking about it actually, there's a lot of power in it to just say like, hey, I'm feeling suicidal right now, or hey, I'm super down, in burnout, feeling a lot of dread, feeling a lot of helplessness, despair. These feelings are normal-ish, but normal because of the society we live in, I should say. Like, it's normal to experience these types of feelings when you are feeling left out and rejected by the whole culture around you, by the people around you. So yeah, I want to remind people of that, and remind people that, again, it's not our autism specifically. Like, all the dark sides, honestly, is mostly because we live in a society that doesn't accept us and doesn't include us. So a lot of the dark sides wouldn't exist if we lived more inclusively and supportively.
Yeah, if we were included and
Yeah.
supported, and
Yeah.
people actually people listen, and
Yes.
people really wanted to help and to
Yeah.
try to help us build a society so that these dark sides that are ultimately needless don't exist for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I want to say.
And thank you for saying it, because it's important. The only thing I would add is that when it comes to neurodiversity, things are fluid. It's all
Yes.
situational. It's all based on there could be
Environment.
there could be some traits that we have that are so near and dear and precious to us and that we love about ourselves, but during certain environments and certain situations in those environments can trip us off, can present
Absolutely.
obstacles instead of aiding us. And so for everyone listening, even if you had heard us mention traits that we like about ourselves that you maybe don't necessarily like about your autistic experience, and vice versa, we see you too. And we recognize that if we are two autistic people with our own lived experience. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're speaking for the entire community, but we are and we are speaking. So thanks, everybody. And if anyone has any thoughts or comments, anything they want to put forward,
Yeah. I would love to hear from, if anyone's autistic, neurodivergent, or otherwise different. I say otherwise different because I include, like, in general, disability in general, that, or any sort of people of color who might be experiencing that othering. I want to hear, I would love to hear from people who experience othering, what makes you feel more included, so that we can share those things in the podcast to our audience, who hopefully will then start to do or practice some of those things. Yeah.
And in so ending, please join us for our next episode, where we will be bringing in a guest, and that guest will be announced at a later date.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
And we're neurodivergent Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. And this is
Alterminds.